Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Today, I am rejoined by Elohim Monard. Elo has been on the podcast several times, our resident expert on all things Latin America, but Elo himself is Peruvian. And Alberto Fujimori, the former and extremely controversial president of Peru, died earlier this month in September. And so it's rare that I have a guest who is so perfectly positioned to talk about something, and this is one where Elo's at the center of it, and he can give you an extremely interesting point of view. I want to thank him not just for taking the time, but how generous he was with his analysis, with his thoughts, with his feelings. This is a personal issue for him because the rise of Fujimori and the fall of Fujimori maps on to his own political life and his own conception of what politics means. So, Elo, thank you for sharing these thoughts. Listeners, I hope you enjoy this episode. I found it extremely educational. If you would like to talk about anything you heard in this podcast or anything else in general, you can always email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Cheers, and I will see you out there. Alberto Fujimori is dead at the age of 86. Elo, how do you feel?
Come on, don't ask how do I feel. That's a very tough question for someone who I have to make some disclaimers here. I was 18 years old in the year 2000. So I was part of the protests that took him off. So eventually he resigned from Japan and he became a Japanese citizen who actually ran for Congress there. But my point is that I was really very in the political realm as a student, as a protester, to get this guy out of Peruvian politics during those days. So I have these memories. These memories built my idea of what Fujimori is. But at the same time, I have to say, I was 10 years old when we were suffering hyperinflation in Peru, one of the worst in the recent contemporary history, we can say, in the world. We had 3,000% of inflation at some point. I was suffering of terrorism very close to my house. There was a bomb that was one of the most terrible bombing attacks that we suffered in the center of Lima, because a lot of these issues happened in the Andean region with peasants, but in Lima there was a different story, right? So I'm saying this to create a background that I understand why people celebrate that he really improved the economy and defeated Sendero Luminoso and MRTA, these terrorist groups, rebels that were attacking our state. But at the same time, I understand why we needed to keep him off the presidency in the end of the 90s. And with this background, I can tell you that I am not this kind of people that would celebrate any death. I think that it's painful for anybody. That being said, I am concerned about how his death was framed by the political elite and media in Peru, because when they are contrasting this good versus bad, they are bringing up the good while saying that the bad doesn't matter. And for me, that is a problem. So we can discuss today that I feel sad about my country, I feel sad about how impunity has become a rule. So we can discuss today, I think, two things. One, the reactions and the responses to his death in a country like this and the political consequences. On the other hand, the broader legacy of Fujimori for our country, and to understand that we have to go to maybe to the nuances of his government that I
Mm-hmm.
already brought some issues on the table, right? In addition to the good things, he um tried to monopolize the whole state without check and balances, without a division of power, capturing, which is equivalent to the Supreme Court, which is equivalent to the Congress. So, and and in a context very corrupt, according to some books, the most corrupt government in Peruvian history, which is not which is not a few because we had corrupt people in our
Yeah.
country, and also with crimes, sentences of crime, not only about corruption but also about uh, creating the conditions and letting annihilation, killing squads to work independently. So let's talk about all of this.
Well, how do you feel? It turned out to be a good question to lead off the conversation, even if it was an uncomfortable one. I'll give you, well, so two things I wanted to reply to what you just said, and then we'll dive into some context. First of all, I mean, you're right. Like, he's a complicated figure, so there's good and bad here. And I'm always reminded of this. I always think of William Manchester's biography of Winston Churchill or Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson, both of whom, figures that are lionized in the past. But in particular, when Manchester introduces the biography of Winston Churchill, the first couple of pages are basically making the case that Churchill was the Hitler of the West, that he had a lot of the similar personality characteristics, and that it was only a time when all hope had failed that he was able to rise to power, and that he had the level of strength and qualities necessary to face off somebody like that. And not the only difference, but the big difference being he was willing to respect democratic politics and democratic norms after the fact. So I was just thinking about that in the context of that. I also obviously don't have a personal connection to Peru or to Fujimori that much, but I will tell you one funny story that I don't think I've ever told you. I was at a funeral for my grandmother's cousin it would have been the early 2010s, and this cousin had two children, and the children would not speak to each other. So even at the reception for the funeral, they would not, like, they had to be on opposite sides of the room. One gave a speech about their mother, then the other they did not talk together the entire time. And one of the children was married to a Peruvian woman. And I didn't realize until after the fact, one of the reasons that these two children split was because this guy had been in Peru. He was I guess he was a reporter, but he was a reporter for a socialist newspaper or something like that. And so he was in Peru in the 70s and fell in love with a young student who was part of the Shining Path in the 1970s. Now, this is the 70s, so this is before the 80s and things get particularly violent. This is when the Shining Path is still a bunch of students taking over student councils and Peruvian governments. And I even got the strength or the courage to go up and ask her what it was like in the 1970s. And she said, it really was just like we were not going to class and playing volleyball all day and reading Marx and talking about Mao. Like, that was her experience of the Shining Path. But because of that affiliation, this and his socialist sort of underpinnings, he had been ostracized from the entire family. And so I spent an hour or two with this former proto Shining Path person at this very strange funeral outside of Washington, D.C. There's my connection to Peruvian politics for you. But let's go back a little bit, because one of my first questions here, because I think it's important to give some context to Fujimori's life too. And the first thing that should stick out to listeners, many of whom have probably not heard of this man, and you should have heard of this man. He was Bukele before there was Bukele. He was Milei before there was Milei. Like, he in some ways is the OG for a lot of the things that we talk about in Latin America in general today.
Yes,
but
he was the pioneer of the kind of authoritarianism that we know today, who is able to manage the law and courts in order to keep his power beyond these old school military coups to stay in power. So, yes, he is the pioneer. In Latin America, at least, he's the one who informed other dictators on how to do these kind of things.
Yeah. And we'll also get into his, I don't know if you want to call him his henchman, the power behind the scenes, Vladimiro Montesinos, and where the CIA gets involved in all this. But I thought it would be good to just start with, and because this is the thing, the first place I had to start. Fujimori is obviously not a Peruvian or an Incan or a local or a jungle name. It is a Japanese name. And he was the son of Japanese immigrants to Peru. And I did a little bit of research on this beforehand, and I thought it was an interesting way to set the table, because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Japan was worried about overpopulation. They had land shortages, and they were starting to export some of their people abroad. And one of the places that they started exporting their people to was Brazil, was Peru. And the reason that it was Peru apparently was because of a former president named Augusto Leguia. Am I getting that pronunciation right, Elo?
Augusto Beleguía, who is he's very linked to Fujimori in terms of how they governed for in for 11 years. But go ahead.
But yeah, so he was a manager in the British Sugar Company, and they needed more workers. So they basically, this Japanese guy who was part of the Mitsui conglomerate creates this immigration company, which brings Japanese laborers to Peru to work in the sugar plantations, and then gets kickbacks on all these other sorts of things. And for a 30, 40-year period before World War II really starts to change the way that Japanese people are seen, there's a thriving Japanese community inside of Peru, in large part because, again, Japan is trying to export itself. It's trying to look out. We don't think of Japan that way right now. We think of Japan as insular, as demographics are shrinking, that, they're this kind of mentality. And things apparently started to change in the 1930s, around the time that Fujimori's parents come, in part because a fascist government arises in Peru and doesn't want the immigrants. So they start limiting Peruvian migration and even taking citizenship away from, Japanese migrants to Peru who had been there for periods of decades and things like that. One of the reasons Japanese people were also interested in going to Peru was because they were getting double what they could earn in Japan in Peru for doing this work for a 4 to 5 year period. Very, very hard work. But by the end of the work, you could be wealthy and you could either stay in a well-off community in Lima, or you could go back to Japan and you would have made a lot of money. And so he is a child of this sort of very strange, like, geopolitical moment. And he comes of age in that context. And it's why he was in Japan
One
when
thing
he
to
was
say
trying to
before
flee the country.
we go forward with this: not only a thriving but a beautiful community, what we call it, the Nikkei community, that we recognize as part of our country, and 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 we enjoy their culture in different ways. Maybe the most clear ways, like with food, because we do everything with food. So the Nikkei food is this merge of Peruvian and Japanese food, is something amazing. Actually, one of the best restaurants in Latin America right now, according to rankings, is Maido. Maido is a Nikkei restaurant. So yes, we embraced this culture, and we coexist with them in many ways with the Nikkei community in Peru, to be clear.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful little part of history that probably nobody knows about, and which Fujimori's name at least has us call in. So with that aside, let's go at the man. Maybe set the scene for us, or I can set the scene, Elo, because you're right. The 1980s were terrible for Peru. You had high levels of hyperinflation. Shining Path controlled large swaths of the country. And then you get this Fujimori guy who campaigns as a far left populist.
Against Mario Vargas Llosa, who is now our Nobel Prize of Literature.
Yeah, who was running on a sort of free trade, classically neoliberal,
in a coalition of moderate right-wing liberals. If that makes sense for your audience. In Peru, liberals was more understood as the right at some point because our left was very like dense.
Yeah. And his election, the election result was a complete and total shock, I think, to almost everyone in Peru, because at the same time, the Peruvian armed forces were planning a coup because they didn't think that the situation could continue anymore. And they waited sort of 2 years to do the auto coup, which I'm sure we will sort of get into a little bit. But, Fujimori sort of gets them a little bit of a reprieve. But so he's elected and he immediately turns neoliberal. He
In
does all the stuff.
1990, yes, he's elected as, and he's also one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer in Latin America, of what is recognized as the outsider candidate, the guy who was outside politics and came into politics suddenly. So now you in the US, for your US audience, now you see that Donald Trump maybe in 2016 was this kind of thing. In Peru, it was happening 25 years before.
And he, to your point, well, I guess the story sort of begins there because he comes to power, he throws out his leftist positions. He just becomes a neoliberal practically overnight. And he's working with the Peruvian armed forces. And within 2 years, he's coordinating with the Peruvian armed forces to it's a strange thing. He coups the government without coupping himself. So they shut down Congress, they shut down everything, but he remains the president, so that there's this veneer of liberal democracy at
We
the
call
top,
it
even
self
as
coup. That's the way we call it,
yeah.
autogolpe, self coup. So, but to be more nuanced, during these 2 years, he embraced the Washington Consensus and
Mhm.
he embraced the policies of privatization and spend constraint that allow the country and floating currency that allow the country to really improve economically very quick. I mean, 2 years. The kind of promise that Milei is doing right now. And in addition to that, he um, partnered with the police, mainly police intelligence, to capture Abimael Guzman and all his team, who were the leaders of Shining Path. So in these 2 years, he started to get real goals. He delivered in an unexpectedly way, actually. So with this background, then he gets together with the military to do a self coup, which in practice is I'm going to close any kind of power, additional power in this institutional power in this country, and we will run everything again from zero. But I will stay in power to be sure that everything is enforced in the way that we need.
Is that worth? Would you locate that as well? Let me ask a different question. Why did he do that? Because if he had such success in the first 2 years, why do you felt a need to resort to that? Was it that the Peruvian armed forces were going to make a coup anyway, and he had a pragmatic sense of if I'm going to stay in power or out of prison or even alive, I need to be the one that's calling the shots? Do you think that he didn't trust that the reforms could hold and that he needed more time and more power than he had? Was the Peruvian Congress giving him trouble from that point of view? Why the decision to do that? Because if you just look at the first 2 years of his record, it's a pretty nice looking record, and it's unclear to me why he wouldn't have had massive popular legitimacy for years going forward based on the track that he got Peru going on in 1990.
Because he wanted to go beyond the institutional limits in many ways, and he was starting to develop his corrupt manners. So, in order to have freedom, he needed to get rid of constraints, and the main constraint was the parliament. So he was popular. Everybody loved him at that point. He was very. This is interesting. He was charismatic, being still an Asian with Asian manners, but with this we would call it like Creole way of engaging with people. So you would see everybody would call him at that point Chinito, which is a way of saying this Asian guy from China, but that's not from China, Chinito. And he embraced that and he's, I am the Chinito. And and if he went to, I don't know, a farmer, he would put a hat on he would if he would go to a farm, he would put the hat on of a farmer, and he was also like mimetizing with the different places where he went. So he traveled a lot. He was there, so he was seen. People felt that the president eventually was arriving to their places, to their even to the small towns that never had this kind of authority there. So he had so much power and he wanted to leash this power, but he had institutional constraints. These institutional constraints became problematic, so he decided to get rid of them.
Yeah. Ironically, in the context of the coup, Venezuela was one of the countries that broke off diplomatic relations because it didn't want to recognize the coup of Peru itself. So this is he's also the pre-Chavez figure. So
There is a
um,
beautiful image of Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of Alberto, dancing with Chavez. I will send it to
yeah.
you so you can include it in here while we speak.
This is also where if I could put in a brief clip or a meme or something like that. There's that. I mean, the Star Wars prequels are terrible, but there's that scene where the Republic is dying and the Emperor is given special powers, and the Natalie Portman character says, "So this is how democracy dies," to thunderous applause. And that was true in Peru too, because the support for the Fujimori government increases after the coup. And for at least a couple of years, he's riding high on that. There's even another attempt to get rid of him. There's a military coup that is foiled in what, late 92, early 93, where Fujimori is able to get whatever factions were against him, like, thank you for that coup because we can get you out of there, and now I really have established control. Where and I guess another thing we should, and maybe you can talk about this, I wonder where he went wrong, because even as things get worse towards the end of the 1990s, he's still doing things that you could describe as admirable. 1998, you get the Ecuador-Peru peace treaty, and centuries of conflict over borders between these two countries there's finally some resolution there, and the shining path continues to get taken down, maybe with terrible means, but the shining path itself wasn't exactly a particularly moral group. So where would you locate where things went wrong? Is it 92? Is it later? Was it wrong from the beginning? How do we think about that in context and historical
Two more
context?
pieces of history, one bad, one good. So let's start with the good. So he called for a constitutional assembly when after the coup to build a new constitution. So he has the script that everybody's following right now, right? So he called for a constitutional assembly. So this assembly designed a new constitution more liberal than the one we had before. So it states a lot of economic institutions that we still have, like the independence of the central bank, and that allowed Peru to become an economic miracle during the 2000s. Okay, so this is an important piece because the Fujimori constitution is something that a lot of supporters still remember, especially because the economic growth that we had of more than 6% at some point of our recent history. But at the same time, while fighting with Sendero Luminoso and getting together with the intelligence groups that allowed him to have success, he also allowed a killing squad to work independently. So they killed university students that were suspects to be terrorists but never proved. and they also went into a party in a poor neighborhood in Peru where ice cream, literally ice cream sellers were there with their families, and one kid, 9 years old kid, was killed because this is killing squad got confused, so they went to a different party. So
Mm.
they thought that all these people were terrorists and they killed them all. So it doesn't allow me to say that if they were terrorists, the government was allowed to just go and kill them from zero, right?
Yeah.
But even if you listeners say, okay, they deserve that, okay, they went to the wrong party, okay, and they killed the civilians. So, but the point behind this anecdotes is that Fujimori had no problem of unleashing these killing squads to support his fight against terrorism and having civilians as um, as collateral damages in the process.
Yeah.
So that is, and this is a signal, uh, Jacob, of the kind of power that he was accumulating, right? And at the same time, we have this obscure figure that you introduce like very very slowly a moment ago, but now we have to like let him appear on the picture, which is Vladimiro Montesinos, the that Fujimori uh, assigned as the chief director of the intelligence services in Peru, and he was Rasputin. I think that is the best name that you can use, Jacob, if you're looking for. He was Rasputin. He was this guy with these obscure ideas that played in partnership with Fujimori to make this chess about the coup, about the killing squads, and then about corruption and how to, and then what happened next, and then to how to capture media. Independent media did not exist anymore. How to capture the Congress, how to capture a Supreme Court, and how to make the country a country of one single ruler with a good economy but lack of democracy. And this is the moment when we start this tribulation in the country between those who say if we are happy without economic problems and with security, democracy doesn't matter that much. Or others, I would say, without democracy, we cannot be a real country, a safe country, if we have this kind of repression. So this is the kind of division that still exists in my country.
Yeah. And I mean, I like the Rasputin comparison, but it's Rasputin if Rasputin was trained and funded by the CIA.
Okay, go ahead
Because
with that explanation because you, as a US American, I think that I would love to listen to this from you.
Well, I never miss a chance to talk about the terrible things that the CIA did in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. The first thing to say about Montesinos is that his parents were communists. He had a cousin who was a leader in the Shining Path. His name, Vladimiro, is because his parents loved Lenin. So, like, that's where he got his name from. Um, he graduated as a military cadet at the U.S. Army School of the Americas in Panama. He was probably recruited in the 1970s when he came to the United States on a visit. And there are various reports that he was getting lots of money in the millions of dollars from the United States, even as he was the sort of henchman behind the scenes for Fujimori. And maybe you'll agree with this. Fujimori, it seems to me, is a complicated figure, and his rise and fall.
Just one detail, because
Yeah,
many people will understand this wrongly. Maybe he was expelled from the military in the
yeah,
70s, and then he became partner of Fujimori, but now not as part of the military. But
right.
everybody knew that he was expelled because he was a CIA agent in Peru, and Fujimori, knowing that, hired him.
Yeah.
You can go.
Well, yeah, and just that, Fujimori, his rise and fall, in some ways, it's a story of Peru, and he has periods where he's popular even after he flees to Japan in 2000. The reason he gets arrested in the end is he goes to Chile in 2004 or five, I forget the exact year, and he's thinking he's going to run for president again, and the winds turn against him, and the Chileans arrest him and extradite him, and then he's in jail for a while, and then there's a comeback, and then his daughter's running in the last two elections, and then he's in jail, and then there's the really the honors that he's been feted with in the context of the funeral. All of which is to say, Montesinos is not as interesting a character. He seems to me to be just a thug, and he, in some ways, is the dark side of all of this. And maybe Fujimori. Well, I don't know. Maybe you'll agree with this. It seems to me that Fujimori's biggest mistake or biggest crime, in some ways, was to empower a man like Montesinos, was to let that person do a lot of the dirty work and give him free reign, while he was just going to concern himself with the economy and then enriching himself alongside that. Is that a fair characterization, or am I being too unkind to Vladimir?
And kind with Fujimori at the same time, because it's like, well, his main issue was to work with this guy. So a few caveats. So first, Fujimori, talking about the killing squad again,
Mm-hmm.
Fujimori tried to bring an amnesty for all these killing squad. So it's very clear that he was uh, on their side. Secondly, uh, when so let's understand how Fujimori falls down. Montesinos was in charge. He had a box of money, and he was corrupting institutions and media while recording them in secret. So he invited people to his office. He gave them money, sometimes in big bags, and everything was recorded. So it allowed him to uh, blackmail all these people after the
Mm-hmm.
transaction. So Fujimori was working with Montesinos during the whole period of his government. So the whole. It is not that he appeared at some point. And media, who was shot in many moments, started to denounce this, and Fujimori did not want to see it. Secondly, or thirdly, I think, Fujimori, there is a very interesting piece of the history that his son was recording with his fancy big handycam that he had in 1990 something, and he came into a conversation with Fujimori and Montesinos while they were planning something together.
Mm-hmm.
And Fujimori uh, sees the camera and hey, are you recording this with audio? And he says yes, and you can see the faces. So Fujimori was not so stupid. So Fujimori was in power during 11 years. And one of the key reasons he held in power is because he had Montesinos there. So they were functional to each other, and they were partners. And Montesinos loved the way he had power, which is below the table, giving money to everybody and managing the underground power, while Fujimori doing the delivery work. We can say that Fujimori was on the room in a restaurant, and while Montesinos was in the kitchen. But the restaurant cannot run with both of them at the same time. Okay, so that is the way it worked. Now, actually, what is happening in Peru for the supporters of Fujimori is the opposite of what you said. They are saying, well, actually, Fujimori didn't know anything about this corruption, and Montesinos was the problem. So what you said is like, when you say that his most important failure was to have Montesinos there, actually, it it allows supporters to say that eventually Fujimori was a very good person, a very good citizen that had this obscure person with him that he, oh poor guy, didn't realize that in 10 years, even if he was accumulating power, gaining more power step by step during those 10 years. Come
Hmm.
on, that is not the way power works.
Yeah. Although the flip side of this, and Fujimori was basically on trial, if not actually on trial in the court of public opinion, after he fled Peru in 2000. But that's another interesting part of the story here because his capture of the institutions was not complete because he tries to claim victory in an election in 2000, claims a narrow victory, but people like you in the streets basically throw him out. And he flees to Japan and he spends 5 years living in Japan and then he tries to come back. He's in prison. He spends what 7.5, 8 years in prison before his daughter Keiko gets what was it? It was it Kaczynski was the one who pardoned him in return for support about not being impeached or something like that in 2017. And also he's developed tongue cancer at this point. And then he's out and free for a while. So there's this sort of back and forth about Fujimori's role and his position in Peruvian politics. But the point just being, he wasn't all powerful. He wasn't authoritarian. Like he's kicked out, he's thrown in jail. Maybe he didn't pay for the full weight of his crimes. He certainly didn't serve out his full sentence. But his conquest of the institutions was incomplete. Should we say that?
Two more details. Yes, it was. It was what does it mean incomplete? So incomplete means that you are not Venezuela right now. So you can say that Maduro had an incomplete dictatorship 2 years ago, and now it has a more complete dictatorship. So you're still sizing institutions, right? You always can have more power potentially. Okay, so it is tricky to say that maybe it was not enough. You can always have more, but it was enough to capture the whole state. So maybe that is the way we can
Yeah.
frame it. Fujimori paid $15 million to Vladimiro Montesinos because of, how do you say indemnización? When you finish your work and it's like, thank you, this is the gratitude from the state because you worked with us for 10 years.
Okay. And I know what you're talking about.
Your leave payment, what do you call
Yeah,
it?
I'm forgetting the word, but yes, I understand what you're saying. It's your final. Yeah, keep talking.
$15 million. Okay, because thank you, you work for the state 10 years, so this is $15 million that this is for you. Okay.
Severance is what you're looking for. Sorry.
Yes.
Not
then,
bad. I'd like $15 million severance, please. That sounds good.
And then I don't know if you know the story. So Fujimori fled to Japan because the videos that I was telling about that Montesinos was recording went public. So Montesinos disappeared, and Fujimori fled after like making up a kind of a search to Montesinos. Do you know where Montesinos was found eventually?
I don't. Where was he found?
Panama. And what was the way to Panama? Panama, it was Panama. Give me a second. Do you know what was the way to Panama?
Through the Darien Gap? No. How did he get there?
Well, he went on a sailboat, okay, which name was Carisma, okay, and he was going to Venezuela.
So Chavez, Venezuela at this point.
Montesinos was gonna, but why Venezuela? What was the relationship with Venezuela, right? So there was a lot of exchange of money and arms with Venezuela, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's good context to bring us back to how you framed the discussion at the very beginning, which is what were the reactions and consequences of Fujimori's presidency, and what is the legacy? Why don't we start with the sort of reactions and consequences? Because I mean, you know better than me what ails Peru today. I think some would point to Congress has been overtaken by various factions, and it's really impossible for the Peruvian state to govern. Even as economically, some of the things that Fujimori put in process make Peru a relatively stable economic state, even despite all of the political instability. So, what are some of the reactions and consequences? And we should also say, like, this is a live issue. Like his daughter ran in the last two elections, almost won in the last two elections. If you're
In
a
the last
betting
three
person,
elections, I'm sorry.
last three elections. Sorry. And if you're a betting person, she's probably going to win at some point, wouldn't you think? Especially with how bad things are. I don't know. Maybe
Lula
everybody's
won in the
scared of it.
fifth. AMLO won the fourth, I think, right?
Hmm.
Or third.
So, I mean, Fujimoriism is alive and well, even if Alberto has shuffled off this mortal coil.
Okay, so let's wrap up the legacy to move into the current situation.
Okay.
So I think that the most important legacy in terms of Fujimori's was actually pedagogical. So
Hmm.
he showed a set of potential stealers that what they are able to do with a lot of power in Peru. So actually, I see that what is happening right now with all these followers of Fujimori is that they understand that you can really put the country in your pocket, put the money of the country in your pocket, put the money of the state in your pocket. Okay. So the legacy of Fujimori in terms of corruption is enormous, not necessarily in terms of economy only, but also culturally. Okay, I remember clearly in 2001, I was almost a teenager. I was 19 years old, but I told my dad in that moment is like, the problem that is that now everybody wants to be like Fujimori, right? Which always happens when you have this kind of dictators. Secondly, uh, you have this trade-off between democracy and economy, and democracy and safety. And Fujimori, uh, in partner with the economic elites, created this idea that if you want economy to thrive and security to be enforced, you can or you can get rid of democracy and human rights if you need it. Okay, and obviously this comes to the conversation of who wins and who loses. So those who were more impacted by these institutional issues that Fujimori brought are the most vulnerable people, vulnerable population, right? The rich were better. Those who were killed were the poor, right? Um, so I think that's the legacy, and that's the legacy not only for Peru. That's a legacy for Latin America, and that's a legacy for the world. Fujimori showed a new path of authoritarianism.
Hmm.
That being said, in the last 20 years, 25 years almost, since Fujimori escaped to Japan, where he ran from Congress as Japanese, he then, as you told us, he went to Chile. Nobody understands very well why he went to Chile, and then he was captured in Chile. He was brought to Peru. A trial started, and he was sentenced for. Uh, so this is a difficult figure because he was presented in courts as how do you call it in English? It's like so that he was not the killer. He was not necessarily the intellectual the brain behind the killings, but he having power did not do anything to prevent or avoid or sanction the killing squads. So that he
Hmm.
was sentenced because of that. And he admitted that corruption and that he also had a sentence on corruption. Okay. So 10 years after, in 2017, yes, I was in Christmas. It was December 24th at about 8 p.m. I clearly remember there was in my family. Pablo Kuczynski decides to pardon him while what Fujimori was in prison. So he went out of prison in Christmas. So as you can imagine, that conversations with your family about
Yeah.
Fujimori were really hot, at least. So actually, you had family that couldn't have a dinner because it was like a, a difficult conversation, right? So then he then returned to prison enforced by the international courts, and eventually a few months ago with Dina Boluarte, we have talked about her, this amazing change from the very very left to the very very right in a pragmatism that I still surprised me. Surprises me. I He was out of jail, and he said with his daughter a few weeks ago that he was gonna run for. He was gonna be the candidate for the Fuerza Popular, which is the political party.
I saw that, and that's why I was shocked at his death because the last thing I had read was he was running. And in my head, I was like, "Oh, great! Now he's going to be back." Like there are plenty of 80-year-old leaders out there. So
I think I don't know. So I I do think that Keiko Fujimori is able of anything to get into power. I do think so. I would not be surprised if it was like all a kind of propaganda machinery. Um, this is a family that has been in power or in relationship to power for 35 years in Peru. So in 35 years, you know how power works. You are not naive. Um, and actually, this is the family business, right? So, arguably, Keiko and other siblings have companies, but nobody knows how they started if you don't follow the money from his father's corruption. And this happens in many parts of the world. So Fujimori passed us away because of a combination of a cancer that he had. He had an accident with his hips, and because he was weak because of the cancer treatment and the hip surgery that he had, he eventually passed away. Um, at 86 years old, in September 11th, the same day that Abimael Guzman, the leader of Sendero Luminoso, passed away 2 years ago, both of them had 86 years old when passed away.
the
So
difference, though, being that Alberto got a state funeral, 3 days of mourning from the Peruvian government. Current President Dina Boluarte offers a salute as during the ceremony.
she herself went to the ceremony and had a very important, relevant signaling hug with the family.
So So what does it mean? Like, is history just going to repeat itself again? And I mean, it feels like one door has shut on Peruvian history, and another door opens, and it's the children have come back to try and fix the wrongs. I mean, how do we think about what's going to happen next?
So we can see at least two things here. First, I think we underestimated Dina Boluarte, Jacob.
We sure did. I did. Everybody
She,
did. Pedro Castillo did. Like, who knew?
so she will do anything to stay in power. And she will do it quickly. And she will give a hug, she will kill, she will get rid of anything that could prevent her to stay in power at least until 2026. Okay. So I don't know if she's intelligent, but she's not clueless. So she knows how to navigate this environment, and she has learned. So this is one takeaway from this. So
Hmm.
if she needs to give a hug to the devil in order to keep going, she will do it on camera. And then, in addition to that, so you have that right now, actually, because of the institutional changes that Congress has done after all this mess in Peru. So there is no way that the president can close the Congress as it happened before, but there are many ways that Congress can veto on or actually expel the president. So the president, we have a presidential system which is almost a parliamentarian system. So we elect the president directly, but the president is so vulnerable to parliament right now that you need to govern with the parliament. And
Hmm.
Fujimori has one of the key majorities there. So they need each other. I don't know how it will happen after when Keiko will try to get a part of the image of Dina Boluarte, but right now they need each other. Um, so going to Fujimori and the future of Fujimorism, this is not the beginning of the end of Fujimorism. This is a new hype of Fujimorism. Why? Because we are rewriting history right now. One of the one NGO of business people, the leader wrote an article about all the good things that Fujimori did. It was like three paragraphs of the good things that Fujimori did, and then you had one paragraph that was saying, yes, and then he tried to capture the whole institutions, but that's it. And the next, and descansa en paz, rest in peace, Presidente Fujimori, right? So we're trying, and actually, I'm reading a lot of articles about how all his crimes are trying to be like reframed in a fantastic post mortem exercise of how do you call it in Britain? These people who are like shifting the story. How do you call it?
I don't know.
The I don't know. Okay, so they're trying to change the whole stories right now. I think the media environment allowed this in this moment. Media aligned, economically aligned. Does it mean that Fujimori will win the next election? I think that Fujimori is trying to size the whole institutions from the Congress in order to make the take this in order to make the path shiner for her to become president again. So she's trying to manage not only the votes and the support, but only also the institutions to help her if there is a small margin of difference with the next candidate. I do not think that the South is going to vote for her. I think that their resentment after Pedro Castillo's fall exists still. I think that she will be highly supported by the the economic elite, but I do not think that she will win without institutional supporters, which means that with the electoral court or other entities, like creating the best conditions, if we want to say it in that way.
Hmm. There's two great ironies in this for me. The first is that Montesinos and Fujimori together, probably the two most impactful political figures in Peruvian politics for the last four decades. I mean, maybe we can throw in some Shining Path and other folks. Both outsiders. Fujimori, who comes from a Japanese family that immigrates in the 1930s. Montesinos, who is empowered by the CIA and by the United States. Both sort of external actors within Peru's environment. Maybe these types of people would have emerged anyway. But there's some kind of lesson there. And the second lesson is Fujimoriism today is probably the most coherent political force inside of Peru. They have the name brand recognition. They have, for good and for bad, the legacy of Alberto behind them. Keiko has almost seized the presidency herself already and probably will try in the future. But the lesson of Fujimori himself was that you can be an outsider and come in and change things. That was the lesson of Castillo too. He just was a little more faithful to his principles than Fujimori was, and ran into a buzzsaw of the Peruvian armed forces as a result. So even as we're thinking about maybe it looks inevitable that Keiko will take over and that Fujimorism will rise, the whole point of Fujimorism is that, well, no, if somebody can capture the minds and hearts of the people themselves, they can get in and then try and capture it away from them. And maybe Alberto will continue to become this political soccer ball between all of the different sides inside of Peru. Um, Either way, I imagine that the 2000 version of yourself that was marching against Alberto Fujimori, I imagine that you can't be, if your 18-year-old self knew what Peru would look like today, I imagine that you would be disappointed by what you saw.
I am also disappointed with many people that were against Fujimori at that time. Now they become suddenly supporters. And it talks a lot about the morality and the coherence of the elites, media elites, political elites, right? How can you be in the opposition of Fujimori in the 2000s and now come on cameras to defend his government? So I don't understand that beyond a kind of you're trying to accommodate yourself into this Fujimori wave that will come arguably. At the same time, it talks a lot about how you understand the country, what are the priorities. So, in days that crime is rising and economy is falling, uh, I'm pretty sure that many of these people think that we need a new Fujimori in terms that we need a new kind of dictatorship to put things in order because we need Bukele's, because we need Milei's, and all the story that we have talked about before. What we are saying at the same time with this is that institutions don't matter, right? And how the hell we want to solve this kind of countries without institutions, right? Without strong institutions. But that's the paradox. Elites in Latin America, and particularly in Peru, they don't want institutions, they don't want regulations, they don't want constraints, they want delivery. Can you argue that people also want that? Yes, but in a different way, in terms that the median voter eventually, the people, they want solutions for their problems. And I accept that, right? But at the same time, as it happens in all across the Americas and the world, you can say right now, democracy has not delivered in the way we expected, and we are equalizing democracy to equality of public services. And so people are starting to say, "Hey, democracy has not delivering. There was COVID, economic crisis still there, safety and security is worsening. So we need someone who is out of the political mainstream." And this is the part that you were saying. So if Keiko is part of the political mainstream, is she the person that people want? I don't think so. And that is the miscalculation that elites are doing because they are talking to themselves and they're not talking to the people. I would say that what people want in Peru still after Fujimori is an outsider like Fujimori, but not Fujimori. So we would say an outside what in people's languages, an outsider con los huevos de Fujimori, an outsider with Fujimori's balls. That is what they want, right? But not Keiko Fujimori. Not Keiko Fujimori because of many reasons. But one of the key reasons is that she is in the core of the political establishment for more than 45 years. She was the first lady of his dad when his dad got rid of of her mom at some point
Hmm.
with many accusations of torture. So, and she didn't care. So, and people know it. That being said, Keiko Fujimori knows that, unlike the elite that's supporting her, she knows that she does not have 50% plus one of the population with her. So that is why she needs the institutions to help her with the final push in the next election, in addition to partner with these political elites who don't care about morality, who don't care about institutions, who just care about their political survival.
I think we have to leave. Do you have any parting thoughts, Elo? I think that's a good place to leave it, unless there's anything else you want to say.
No, I think that we have covered all the nuances. So I am not a Fujimori supporter, as you can see. I can recognize that was during his period, the first period in government, that he managed to improve economics and improve safety in Peru. Thank you for that, but you're a fucking dictator. That is maybe my point, which is different than the point that thank you for that, and because of that, I will forgive you everything. I was thinking, right, actually, and this is the final idea, and I want to write about this. Imagine that you have a single mother, and you are three siblings, and you have a new father who come to the family, and he comes with money. He solved the economic issues that you had and you were suffering with this mother. But in order to have this new life of wealth, you accept abuse, you accept um, violence, you accept even torture to at least one or all of these siblings.
Hmm.
So, can you accept that in order to have this wealthier life? So, I think that this is the kind of conversation that we need to have. And I think that Peru decided to be wealthier instead of abuse and repression. And and I and that makes me really sad. And that makes me, I don't know if angry. I I think it's sadness. I think it's like kind of melancholy.
I can't add anything to that. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and feelings.
Thank you, Jacob. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.